need this water, so I'm gonna.
Oh, it's in a can.
Hello, hello. Thank you all so much. This is more than I anticipated. But welcome to A Presidential Campaign is Taking More Risks Than Your Brand. Our session for today. So I'm Brooks Miller. I'm our EVP of Influencer here at Edelman. I came from Twitter. We call it Twitter. We don't call it X in my world. And before that, I was agency side at creative agencies like 72 and Sunny and a small place called Baird SF in San Francisco. So I'm very excited to be here, and I'm your moderator today. It's nice to see all of y'all. So I get to introduce you to all of our lovely panelists. First and foremost, we have Jeremy Thompson. Hi, Jeremy.
Hey, how's it going?
I'll do the honor of reading you your accomplishments. But
Oh, God, no.
Jeremy's an SVP at Edelman, where he co-leads the election and tech offerings at Edelman's Global Advisory. We have had you busy.
It's been a busy
lately.
year.
Before Edelman, Jeremy was Kamala Harris's social media director, no big deal, during her 2020 presidential election campaign, so thank you for that. Jeremy has a BA in history and political science from the University of Mary Washington and a master's in strategic communication from American University. Thank you for being with us. You can clap.
Thank you.
Then we have Khalil Green. He's also known as the Gen Z historian. He is a New York Times, Wall Street Journal, Forbes magazine recognized digital educator with nearly 1 million followers, and a Peabody, no shade. That is amazing, so cool. He also graduated from Yale, big deal, with a degree in history. He served as the college's first ever Black student body president. It was about time. Woo! Yeah. He's known for his TikTok series, Hidden History, which dives into the stories of American injustice. Thank you for being here.
Of course, thank you for having me.
Yeah.
Thank you.
And last but not least, we have Gabe Gomez. Gabe is the head of social for Macau Beauty. With over 8 years of experience, Gabe has played critical roles in scaling the TikTok presence of brands you may have heard of, like Verizon, TJ Maxx, eBay, Axe Body Spray, and more. He is an Edelman alum and helped create our Gen Z lab, which consults CMOs on the enigma that is Gen Z. So thank you. What a cool crew. So we wanted to jump right into the subject matter of this, which is something that we have been noticing that's going on in culture. AI memes, Brat, HQ. We are seeing some unprecedented, risk-taking in both the Harris and the Trump campaign, which I think is a deviation from what we expect from political advertising. We think of that as very Americana, very suit and tie. And this is definitely not that. So we want to talk about it. Like, why do we feel this change is happening? What's the deal?
Well, that's the question of the day, right?
Right?
I think the reality is the reason we're seeing this evolution, and I'll let the historian here talk about the history behind that, but we're seeing the evolution because it's a necessity, right? We are at an environment right now where media are no longer the gatekeepers for political candidates, and we've learned over the past decade or so, in order to talk to an audience, especially an increasingly younger and more tech-savvy audience, we need to harness all the power that's at our fingertips. So, for example, when we think about, Kamala Harris's recent interview on, Call Her Daddy, for example, that is an audience of engaged women between the ages of 24 and 35, and the whole interview is about reproductive rights. There is fewer audiences that are that large where you can talk about a specific issue without having to be filtered through media. And because our firm is nonpartisan, President Trump recently did an interview with Dave Ramsey, right? And Dave Ramsey, for those of you who might not know, he talks about how to budget, how to save money. But he spoke about the economy during the interview. And Ramsey's audience tends to slant conservative. It tends to slant working and middle class, for example. And so without the media filter, he can get the interview out there to more people. And so, we have to do it because the reality is politics isn't as sexy as we'd like it to be. And if you're going to tackle those audiences to turn out the vote, you have to go where your audience is.
Yeah, and you can control your message on those places.
Oh, exactly.
So much more than legacy media, too.
Yep.
For sure.
Yeah, I totally agree. And I think that one aspect of social media that is really important is that the need to go onto social media also relates to the competitiveness of campaigns and also the competitiveness of business. So you see a lot of the Kamala Harris campaign and the Donald Trump campaign using creators, using TikTokers. And I would trace the origin of this to shortly after 2020 with the rise of TikTok and the influence that it had on Biden's campaign and the heavy investment that the Biden administration had with creators and with influencers. So this might be an unknown story, but back in 2022, right when Russia decided to invade Ukraine, one of the first things that the White House communications team did is arrange for 30 TikTok creators to meet with the National Security Council to have a briefing on the war in Ukraine and on getting information to these creators to then disseminate. Of course, these creators had free agency over what they could say, and I know this because I was one of those creators, but it was quite an absurd, I think in many people's eyes, moment for that to happen. So absurd, in fact, that the week after this happened, Saturday Night Live did a parody of the event, which we have a clip of that we'll be showing right now.
We actually have a clip of it if y'all want to run it. This is, you guys, I'm always scared about AV, so hopefully this works. We'll try one more time. We can always run it back. Okay, we'll try in a little bit.
Yeah, no worries. We'll get you, we'll keep
We
you
have
seated
proof.
if
We
you're
have the
interested.
receipts. You were parodied on SNL. That's like pretty amazing.
Yeah, it was a pretty big thing that happened. And I think what made it even bigger is that a lot of reports came thereafter showing that Vladimir Putin also used influencers in Russia to disseminate his own information about what was happening in a more authoritarian way. So there's to the point of necessity, it's not an option whether or not you can use creators or influencers for your campaign and for your political messaging. And I think the difference between these political campaigns and politicians and brands is that when it comes to politics, when it comes to war, there's no luxury of sitting by and saying, okay, maybe we'll get with creators and influencers in our next quarter and we'll look into this. When it's life or death, you have to do what the research is telling you. And all of the research points to social media being one of the biggest places for influence and impact. And I think that what brands and companies need to do, and something that I always tell them, is they have to create that sort of life or death energy within their own organizations to show that if you aren't on social media and you aren't working with creators, it'll be the death of your company or your brand or your campaign. And that's something that I think the political leaders that we've been seeing in the past few years have really internalized.
Yeah, it's almost like the time-sensitive nature of campaigns is a forcing function for you to make these decisions and really get in these conversations. You don't have time to waffle.
Exactly.
Yeah, it's interesting too, like one of the things that really made us want to have this entire panel was the fact that we're seeing almost the opposite amount of risk-taking on the brand side. I've already heard Bud Light mentioned today. I'm sure it'll get mentioned 15 more times. And I just feel like a lot of brands are starting to become incredibly hesitant to work with creators, to work in this kind of risk-taking environment. And so I'm gonna pick on you, Gabe, as kind of our brand liaison.
Yes.
Yeah, why are you feeling this hesitancy and what are you doing about it?
Yeah, I mean, I think there's a lot of reasons. One, you just mentioned Bud Light. I think when brands fail big, other brands notice. And I remember when the Bud Light thing happened, that's all brands talked about for a while.
Yeah.
From a how do we avoid this perspective to a just being shocked of the impact, the negative impact that had on different groups. And then also how it was handled, I think, after the fact, right? I think there needs to be a level of dedication that you have as a brand if you're going to sort of work with someone who identifies as LGBTQ or whatever they sort of believe in, that your brand believes in it and that they're not going to sort of retract from that.
Yeah.
So I think that's a part one. And I think a part two is, Khalil, like you sort of mentioned, there is a bit of a life or death sort of sense of urgency that brands need to adapt, and they just haven't. Especially legacy brands, brands that have been around for so long, they love to stick to the process, which of course is great for their day-to-day and maybe for planning, but when it comes to social, it moves so quickly, and conversations sort of also change really drastically overnight sometimes. So I think brands sort of need to be a little radical in how they shift to adopt with the times, because if not, like you mentioned, they're going to be forgotten or they're not sort of catering to the audience of today and tomorrow, like Gen Z and Gen Alpha.
Yeah, I think Gabe's right. I think there's little consequence to a politician attacking a brand at the end of the day.
Yeah.
Politicians can say, I don't like brand A. They could go off on the stump and they'll talk about it, but the brand will get attacked. They might lose revenue, right? They might lose followers on social media. They might lose, at the end of the day, shareholder confidence, and some brands have lost their CEOs, communicating in this environment. And so, the reality is, I think you're absolutely right. We need confident organizations who can go forward with what they value. But I think sometimes that timidness comes because there have been some brands out there who have been dragged in front of the public opinion spotlight where they don't want to be. And in a political year, it's the worst time for a lot of brands when they think about it. But there are solutions, which is a good thing.
Yeah, I mean, the solution is to be prepared.
Yeah, right.
Like, no one wants to be in town square with their pants down. Like, we need to have preparedness plans for these types of things if you're going to engage in these conversations.
Absolutely.
It's kind of my main piece of advice for any brand. I think we're able to get the AV working. My best friend Eric in the back is giving me a thumbs up.
This week, as the war in Ukraine intensified, access to Facebook and Instagram in the country was shut off, leaving only one source of information, TikTok. So on Thursday, the White House responded by holding a national security briefing with some of the nation's top TikTok creators. We take you now inside that historic meeting.
Thank you all so much for coming and answering your nation's call at a time.
Yo, we're just as entertaining as SNL. Come on. But I mean, you've made it when you've been parodied on SNL. I mean, come on.
Yeah,
Incredible.
I mean,
Incredible.
you see the impact of what was occurring, and I think that that's something that can't be taken away.
And it's a big embracing of creator economy and creators and their point of view and their voices. I think it's really cool and notable. So also, Gabe, like, again, I'm going to continue picking on you. Sorry about that.
Love it.
We have a lot of brand marketers in the room. Like, what is your decision tree on when you do engage in some of these more spicy topics?
Yeah, I mean, I think a lot goes into that decision and the process. I think one is sort of, let's figure out what we stand for and what sort of space we want to play in, right? Like, brands realistically can't be everywhere all at once. If they did, they might not do it all well. And it's not always worth the investment, if that makes sense. So
Yeah.
I think one process we like to follow is sort of like, let's all hold hands before something happens. Like, let's agree we're gonna focus on these three sort of purpose spaces. Once we have identified those spaces, let's chat with our legal team. Let's say, hey, like, can we sort of have a scale of low, medium, high in terms of like what can we do, what risks can we take, and have some sort of groundwork laid out. So when it comes to game time, you can turn something around in 24 hours or less.
Yeah.
But you sort of have to lay the groundwork a little first, because that's when you really get into the whole, okay, well, let's spend a week making this decision because we need to talk to 20 people internally first, right? You want to sort of avoid all that and make sure you lay the groundwork first.
You know what I love about that, besides hand-holding this close after COVID? One of the things that, like you mentioned, was like knowing what you stand for ahead of time in advance. And I think that's so important. And so I think like brands need to understand what their permission space is when it comes to action. Where does the public expect you to act? And I think to add to that, the cultural and political context is important. If your organization does a lot of work to help immigrant communities in the United States, in 2001, for example, the immigration content in America was a lot different than it is now, right? We're having a very different conversation. And so understanding that the cultural context today, it's anti-immigrant, it comes across as very xenophobic at times, and it is one of the top 3 political issues of our time. You might modify how you speak about that issue during an election year. You'll still stand on your values, which is important, but you might not run the same aggressive campaign you would have run maybe 5 years ago, 4 years, 3 years ago, because that political and cultural context has changed. And so I love this idea of being prepared for in advance, because if the political and cultural context changes, you can also internally figure out how you communicate to your audiences where it stands the most. The last thing you want to do is waffle and go backwards, because then you've made both people mad. And there are several organizations this year who have done just that. Where they have made both their supporters and detractors mad. And if both sides are mad, you're not ever going to win.
Yeah, because people can sniff it out if you're not consistent in your value system. And that's something we see in data over and over and over again, and is obviously especially important with Gen Z, who cares so much about brands really standing for something. I don't know if y'all heard, but there is a presidential election in the U.S. next month. Does anyone?
Can you ask Gabe this question?
Has anyone gotten a text message from someone running? Because I get it every day. So there are a lot of brand marketers in the audience. Y'all are highly online individuals. What are some things that these campaigns are doing well that we should be stealing for our brands?
Yeah, I can speak a little bit. Well, I would say that one thing that really stands out from, I would say, both campaigns is their investment in creators. And I mean that in a way that goes beyond just like monetary investment or getting creators on board with whatever message they want to put out. They really are wining and dining creators and going above and beyond a briefing. And I would say that that's something that rarely, if ever, happens between the actual brand and a company or an agency and a creator whenever there's a deal. Like there's a very logistics heavy, maybe some small talk on the Zoom conversation that happens, but it's rarely like I would say oftentimes it's not where the creator feels really valued by the brand and like the brand's going above and beyond and giving them either like free services or free product. And I think that that feeling of personalized investment is, once again, born out of necessity during a campaign year, but that could also be replicated by companies and by brands so that creators feel that even when the brand deal is over, or let's say it doesn't perform as highly as you want to, they'll want to go above and beyond to reciprocate. But if there's no sort of investment in the beginning, then there's nothing to reciprocate. And it's such an easy way of getting so much more out of the creator partnerships that you do.
I love that. And what I love about that point of view is the brands that are doing that, they're treating, I mean, you are a CEO of your own business.
Yeah.
You're an LLC. This is a CEO in addition to all his other millions of accolades. But what's cool about that is you have a relationship with your followers that you owe them, you know, verified information, authentic relationships and partnerships. So when it doesn't feel transactional from the brand, it doesn't feel transactional to your followers, which I think is really huge.
Yeah.
I interrupted. You guys are nodding. I feel like you have things to add. In terms
Well,
of tips
I'll
and tricks.
add like another hot C word is community.
Yeah.
And I think like
Hot C word.
Hot C word will, if you can keep up the
Creators
trend
and
for your
community, love it.
answer. But I think the best sort of way to connect with your audience is to do it in a way that feels relatable. And I think that's what we've seen this go around. The content and the messaging is directly fed by what other people are saying and what the communities that care about these candidates are saying as well. And I think they've done obviously a great job, but I think brands sort of need to take that cue as well. And this is a great case study for exactly that, right? Instead of a brand sort of going into a meeting room and having ideas in a bit of a vacuum with executives, how can they sort of bring the insights from the community and bring that into the room and sort of feed off of that. So in addition to the creators, make sure you're kind of sort of tailoring to the community and that your messaging is going to resonate with the folks who care about it the most.
Yeah, like let the community inform the creative, not the other way around.
Totally.
It's the right way to go.
Absolutely.
What did you think?
I mean, honestly, that's the two best answers I could think of. But, you know, there's another thing that I think is important here. One campaign is doing this very well, and the other one is struggling a bit. But, you know, conciseness of messaging. I think a lot of times as brands and as organizations, we're like, we want to talk about everything at one time. There was a point during this election where a lot of people said, well, why isn't, you know, Kamala Harris doing more media interviews? Well, because she was on the podcast and on social media, for example. But did you notice that every time she rolled up someplace, she had the same thing to say each time?
Yep.
She talked about what? The opportunity economy, when she talked about abortion, the freedom to choose was important to her and Governor Walz. And each time, and because we have to follow this all day long, we're like, we've heard this before, but that repetition and consistency of messaging is crazy important because every time you engage with your audience, a new section's going to hear it. And so you have to make sure you're consistent. Now, on the other side of the Trump campaign, one thing they're doing very well right now is they understand who their audience is and what they're looking for.
Yes.
They know that it's an emotional campaign right now. And so they are appealing to a core section of people in this country who agree with that emotional audience and who are afraid of the other side. And so, like, you know, whether we agree or not agree with the tactic and how it's used, I think the conciseness of the messaging is critically valuable for the Harris campaign. And for the Trump campaign, understand that audience and digging deeper into there is going to be important because at the end of the day, swing states are going to determine turnout and where this election is going to go. And we have to speak to those people. 12,000 votes will determine Michigan and Wisconsin most likely. And so they understand that.
Call your friends in Michigan. Yeah. Did you raise your hand?
I was just like pinging. I don't have to do it outside of Zoom. Yeah, I would say something else that really stands out to me is the ability of both campaigns to go with the flow.
Yeah.
Because I think for anyone who's launching a presidential campaign, the first thing that you don't like that comes out about you to the world might not be top of mind, that it's going to be a meme about like falling out of a coconut tree. But the way that the Harris campaign really leaned into that and like made it a whole thing, as well as the tweet from Charlie XCX, like they didn't try to manufacture a rollout and stick to that. They released their agenda as it happened. And I think an analogous situation maybe with the Trump campaign is like after he was, there was an assassination attempt immediately there were shirts, it was a photo,
Yeah.
it was a viral moment. It was used for the campaign. There was the like bandaged ear trend of like whatever that was. But there was a lot of resourcefulness, I think, from both sides, and that they turned lemons into lemonade wherever it came up without any sort of hesitation. Whereas a brand, let's say like your brand name goes viral because some random teenager does like a crazy trend that's maybe a little bit dangerous, but for whatever reason it's the most like viral thing in the world, you would want to lean into that moment, research it, invest in that creator, bring them on, because those opportunities, you can't predict them and you can't manufacture them, but you have to go with the flow and release whatever agenda you have, because those are the moments that'll create authenticity.
Yeah, it loops back to what you were saying, like listening to the community and then creating your comm strategy from there.
Yeah, people make fun of Donald Trump for his dancing all the time. If you went to the RNC this year, there was an entire segment on his dancing. It was one of those popular things there. You know, if you're a Democrat watching that, you might be, that's kind of weird, but if you're a part of the Republican audience and you have a good sense of humor, it played really well, and it was a very big success for them.
Yeah, leading to stand culture, I love it.
Yeah.
Okay, shifting gears, Khalil, I'm gonna pick on you next, our Gen Z historian. This is my personal observation. I just feel like Gen Z is the most unserious but serious generation. I mean, y'all care so deeply about these really, really intense issues, gun control, gender fluidity, right to choose. But then that's contrasted with some of the things that I see online. And I'm gonna try and cue up another AV if this is gonna work, of a TikTok that I saw. And I was like, so what's happening with this generation? So if we can play this TikTok, this is the opposite of the serious piece.
They're eating the dogs, they're eating the cats. Eat the cat, eat the cat. They're eating the dogs, they're eating the cats. Eat the cat, eat the cat. They're
So like, it's a little, there's two sides to the coin. And if y'all aren't familiar with whatever that was, that is some choreography to a remixed audio of Donald Trump from the presidential debate saying that people in Springfield, Ohio are eating dogs and eating cats. So, you know, that, and then really, really emphatic about gun control, two kind of opposite sides of the coin. One thing that I feel like, and I love the dichotomy, to be completely honest. I think it's really cool. It shows y'all's depth. But I wonder, is there a math around where we are serious and where we are unserious? What's kind of the architecture of that?
I think that's a really good question. To understand Gen Z, I think you have to really give it a timeline of like when we were born / alive. So I was born the year before 9/11, but most Gen Zers were born after. So that's like the first thing that happens. It's commemorated every year. We don't exactly know what happened because we didn't live through it, but we hear like all of this grief and like see replays as we're in pre-K to kindergarten. And then shortly after that was the 2008 financial crisis. Shortly after that was the Sandy Hook shooting, school shooting that we were raised with. And then shortly after was the rise of Black Lives Matter after so many police shootings. Then Donald Trump became president for the first time, which created a lot of polarization, I think objectively speaking. And then shortly after that was the pandemic.
Yeah.
So for Gen Zers, there's a lot of, I would say, grief that has been, trauma has been put onto us, both from us experiencing it, but also from the older generation sort of passing it down. While at the same time, the way for us to have an outlet was largely through social media platforms and the connectivity that those created. So meme culture, Vines initially, now TikToks, then Instagram posts, Tumblr blogs. So I think that the outlet for us became to laugh at the absurdity of what's so horrible about the world. And that's almost like a part of the culture of like what you can call Gen Z culture. So when a presidential candidate accuses immigrants of eating dogs and eating cats based off of like false information, it's so absurd that whereas maybe before it would be like New York Times headline, or even now a New York Times headline denouncing it and debunking it on every turn, for our generation, we just have to laugh at it because if you don't laugh, you're gonna cry. Yeah. Exactly.
It makes sense though. I mean, it's almost like a language, a shared language is the through thread is the humor so that you can talk about kind of these big, intense, emotionally really laborious ideas.
Yeah. It's like one big inside joke to like not take anything seriously.
True. Yeah.
And it really, I mean, it baffles like other generations, I'd say, and maybe in other cultures, but I think for us, it creates that community to constantly react in this way.
Yeah, I love it. It's so cool. I mean, I think you guys have been through a lot. But I love it, and I think humor is like the great communicator too. switching gears a little bit, we had a trust report come out, Edelman did recently, that was all about brands and politics. What is driving purchases? Why are brands participating or not participating in politics? And what do we advise clients to do? One of the things that I think is really interesting from it is that people truly are voting with their wallet. And more than that even, 6 in 10 people are making their purchasing decisions according to the politics of that brand. So if I am really into REI's commitment to sustainability, I'm going to be loyal to REI and go and purchase their products versus a competitor. I think that's really, really interesting and very compelling data. I wonder, with you guys talking about this specifically political conversation, should brands lean into politics?
Yeah, and I mean, the answer is...
how?
Yeah, the answer, I love the question,
Thanks.
but I'm going to modify it just slightly.
Okay.
Brands are in politics whether they like it or not.
True.
The reality is some of the Edelman Trust data also said that when brands backed up and stayed quiet, consumers were like, but silence is making a statement. The second thing we found with the trust data was that the everyday actions that brands do, like sponsoring the Olympics, advocating for themselves on a regulatory standpoint, the stuff government affairs does in DC, or even hiring influencers to talk about their content, audiences found that as political. And so if you're a brand, you're like, well, I don't want to do politics, but consumers see everything you're doing as politics anyway. And so can brands stay out of politics? The answer is no. But there is hope, because the reality is when you lean into politics and you figure out what your permission space is, you know what you can speak about externally, you know what your employees want you to talk about internally, and that will help you navigate the political process. And what that looks like is this. So a lot of organizations said after the Dobbs decision that they didn't want to comment on abortion in the United States. But a lot of organizations that we work with have employees across the US who are impacted by reproductive choices. Yeah. They offer benefits. In fact, open enrollment starts next month, so make sure you sign up for your open enrollment if your job offers it. But they realize that they need to look at their policies internal and figure out what they were going to do to A, accommodate the decision, or B, make sure their employees knew what their options were, especially if you're in states that are impacted specifically by this decision. And so the reality is, that's what we're talking about. Leaning into politics doesn't mean launching an entire campaign about your values to the world. It can, right? But it does mean that making sure internally, at least, your house is in order and you're having the conversations that matters within that political and cultural context. I think if you believe that your brand is not politically involved, then you really should have a deep conversation about if you hire people or if you employ people. Because right now, employees are tense, they're agitated because there's an election in less than 30 days. And the consequences of those elections are going to impact everyone within your organization, especially those who are most vulnerable.
Yeah. I think of it as there's a permission space, and then there's a scale within that permission space. How big is your microphone, really? What are you gonna say?
And I love what you said. It's sort of commit. Don't just say, oh, we don't want to be involved, but say, let's be involved, and how? And how are we going to participate in conversations that matter? Because if you're just thinking about, you versus a competitor, if you do the good work of aligning yourself to what matters to your community, they're going to notice. And when they're making a decision to pick up a product, engage, open an email, or even refer you to a friend, or when they talk about you in the group chats, oh, I hate this brand because, or I'm not going to buy from this brand anymore because they said something, they said this, or they didn't say that.
Yeah.
Those conversations matter, and we don't see them as brand marketers because we're doing the work and sort of in the thick of it. But listen to your audience, and if there's a conversation bubbling that aligns with what your brand cares about and what your audience cares about, there's no reason to shy away from that. So I would encourage folks to have the conversations and be honest and challenge the status quo within the organization.
Yeah, and I would also say that you have to realize not everything is going to be 2024, and there'll be 20, 30 years down the line when people might have a reckoning and look back at what your company was doing right now or in the future. So whereas silence might work in some instances, in this period, or might seem like it's working, it could have a really big backlash later on. And that's what we saw in 2020. Companies were being evaluated based on how many black people they had hired or what sort of practices they had been doing for their employees related to DEI, and so many had nothing to show for it. So they made these huge commitments to try to catch up to everyone else, whereas others had this long-standing 30, 40-year commitment that showed and shined through. So it's not just about looking at the right now, but also in the far future.
I love it. You guys how incredible are they? I feel so inspired. Thank you to Advertising Week for having us. This was a wonderful conversation. Have a great rest of your day. Thanks so much.